everyone, my name is Rachel, and recently I've been reading a book called Genesis as History, Biblical and Scientific Evidence that Genesis presents the truth about Earth's history. This is a book which kind of presents itself as a textbook, but it does have a lot of problems to it. I'm not sure how it ever got published actually. No, wait, I take it back. Pretty sure it's self-published, which kind of explains a lot. Now, I downloaded this book and started to read it for a couple of reasons. The first being that people keep saying I should respond to more serious Christian speakers and thinkers and so on, and this guy who wrote this book, he has a PhD, so he's gotta be pretty serious, right? I think I can trust him. Actually, I can't, but we'll get to that in a minute. And also, I decided to download and read this book because I like to be challenged, and this book pretty much goes against everything I know about the evidence of the universe, and it's pretty detailed, and I thought if anything is going to change my mind, it's going to be a book like this, so I thought it would be a good one to challenge myself with. Am I rambling? Point is, I thought I'd read it and give it a go. Now, it's a big book, so we're going to be looking at it in a couple of little chunks, because I want to do a really thorough review for you guys. I'm going to be looking at it in a few sections over a couple of videos. But today I just want to start by talking about the introduction of the book and talking a little bit about the author himself and also his kind of methods and his beliefs and why I have a few doubts about him and this book before we even get into the bulk of it. So let's begin by reading a little bit about the author. His name is Dr. Daniel A. Biddle, PhD. He likes to put the PhD after his name. And I can see why. It does tend to give people a little bit of authority, you know, when they introduce themselves as doctor, and that's a good thing, right? Except his background, his education, his PhD is in organisational psychology and organisational behaviour, not actually anything to do with natural history or theology or whatever. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't make him qualified to talk about this stuff, right? I don't have a background in, you know, education-wise, in natural history or in theology, and I still enjoy talking about it for fun, right? He could very well have studied this or worked in a field, outside of formal education. He might know his stuff, so I'm not, criticising him for that, but it is a little bit misleading to put PhD on the cover of your book when it's in something completely unrelated to the contents of the book. And no, maybe that's just me. I've studied organisational behaviour and organisational psychology and stuff. It was a pretty big part of my business degree. That's what my bachelor's is in. So if I wrote a book on management or marketing or organisational behaviour, I could easily sign it off Rachel Oates, BSc, and that would be fair enough. But if I was to go out and write a book on astrophysics and author it as Rachel Oates, BSc, I feel like that might be a little bit misleading. Same as if my boyfriend Dan, he wrote a cookery book about biscuits, and he authored it as Daniel Seabright, MEng. It kind of sounds like he's got a Masters of Engineering in baking cookies, right? I mean, he doesn't. It's in computer science, completely different. But you see my point. Kind of put in that PhD, BSc, MSc, MEng, whatever you want, kind of putting that on the end of your name. It's not a lie. It's not untrue. You have that qualification. It just doesn't exactly feel like you're telling the truth. And I don't know what it is. It's just something about this that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. But I'm probably being pedantic. Let's move on. Anyway, as well as his unrelated PhD, Daniel, not my boyfriend Daniel, the author of this book. When I say Daniel, I'm going to be talking about him, not mine, Danny. It's complicated, I know. So anyway, he is also the president of Genesis Apologetics Inc., a 501c3 organisation. Of course, they're tax exempt, of course. Yeah, they do some good work apparently. They are dedicated to equipping youth pastors, parents and students with biblical answers for evolutionary teaching in public schools. Daniel has trained thousands of students in biblical creation and evolution and is the author of several creation-related publications. Cool, so they get their charity status and tax exemptions because they are doing the wonderful work of lying to and misinforming young people. Coolsies. Seems fair, doesn't it? But, Daniel also has a pretty personal investment in this book and its topics. It's not just about making money for him. He writes that my Christian life totally changed after I understood that Genesis includes real history. without even knowing it. I used to have a hidden dark fog of doubt in my mind. Even as a seminary student in my 30s, I would have told you that I believed the whole Bible. But now I see that I was unsure about the very beginning. Now, I'd argue that if you seem unsure about the beginning, about the story in Genesis, that's probably because it's very, very unlikely, pretty much impossible, that that stuff happened. I think it's pretty fair to be unsure about it. I think it's pretty fair to not believe it. Not only is there no evidence for it, but there's literal evidence against it. Like actual, objective, independent evidence that says, this isn't what happened. This is probably what happened. But let's not get into the specifics of that right now. Let's find out what supposedly changed Dr. Daniel's mind. He writes, when going through Genesis, the seminary professors did a good job of explaining how the original language of Genesis 1 and connecting genealogies of Genesis 5 clearly led to a young Earth, fitting inside 10,000 years. However, they were also quick to point out that secular science seemed to have a Loctite case of millions of years. Just throwing this out there, but has the author, Daniel, actually considered that the Bible simply tells a story, and that any supposed evidence of the Earth being X amount of years old, or any supposed history in the Bible of the Earth itself being created or whatever, is all simply anecdotal? And has he considered that the evidence that secular science has, as he likes to call it, that's actual evidence? That's stuff that they've gathered and interpreted, and from there they've concluded that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Is not just the result of hearing some stories, it's actual facts and stuff. Just throwing that out there. Anyway, he was perfectly happy to just ignore reason, and he says that he lived with unresolved tensions for many years about how old the Earth is and how many years it's been around, until he heard her talk about dinosaurs and Noah's flood. I'm quite interested to see where he goes from here, but I will say, if that talk was given by Ken Ham, he immediately loses all his credibility. But he doesn't specify, so it could be by someone reputable, I guess. Okay, so he goes on and he writes, that began a season of intense research on two topics of Noah's flood and dinosaurs. Being trained as a behavioural scientist, I was familiar with the distinctions between good and bad evidence. He literally puts evidence in quotes. And I used these skills in wading my way through mounds of material covering earth science, archaeology, paleontology, biblical interpretation, and geology. Now, I don't want to be purposefully picky here, but I will say that while the methods of gathering, analysing, and interpreting evidence do share some characteristics between, natural hard sciences and social sciences, there's also some pretty huge differences. When I switched from studying biomed at uni to business, including organisational behaviour, as is Daniel's background, when I switched to studying that at uni, there were some big changes. And honestly, it kind of felt easier coming from a hard science background to a social science. Biomed, the research was a lot more objective and fact-based. There was less of personal interpretation of data, and there was less of a kind of human factor affecting what the actual raw data could be. So there were no unconscious biases or personal opinions or personal agendas or anything like that getting in the way. So very, very different techniques were needed in handling the two types of data. And like I say, if I'm honest, going from a natural science to a social science, it was kind of easy enough. But if I were to go from a social science to a natural science, without any formal training, I feel like that's a bit too much of a step up. I was lucky that when I did my A-levels, we got to do our own research projects, both in sociology and in biology. So I got to have kind of first-hand experience of doing research from both perspectives there, which meant that when I got to uni, I was okay going into the biomed research and I was okay going into social science research because I'd had experience of both, and it was just kind of about learning to do it in a slightly more professional way, I guess you could say. But yeah, I think if I'd only ever had a formal training in social science research, then gone on to biomed, I think that would have been tough, seriously. So, I might be wrong, but I personally don't really see how having a background in social sciences, specifically in organizational psychology and organizational behavior, I'm not sure that really qualifies you to be 100% trusted in wading through, as he says, and analysing natural science research, particularly the complicated stuff like paleontology and geology and archaeology and, the stuff that takes a hell of a lot of years to kind of understand properly. I couldn't do it. Not a chance. Not without some proper, training and learning and stuff. Yeah, I feel like without any formal training, it's very hard to trust someone's just personal interpretation of data in those fields. And then Daniel goes on to say something that kind of really loses my trust. So he talks about how a lot of biblical evidence is anecdotal, and then he says, both biblical creation and evolution both suffered from this limitation, because we simply cannot go back thousands of years and observe the unfolding of the creation week described in the first chapter of Genesis. Likewise, we cannot go back and see if millions of years really happened. I knew that both views required faith. And that's just a basic misunderstanding of studying natural history and geology and so on right there. It has nothing to do with faith. People who research the history of the earth, who research geology, paleontology, archaeology and so on, there's no faith involved. It's not a matter of them coming up with a story and then convincing people to believe it. It's about finding objective, independent evidence through controlled experiments or observations or whatever, and testing it in ways that can and have been repeated by others, using methods that have been tried and tested and adapted and upgraded over the years, and getting results which are as reliable and accurate as possible. There's no faith and there's very little interpretation or personal interpretation involved. None of the evidence is anecdotal. None of the evidence is personal or subjective. I mean, just as a very basic example, I'm not an expert on this, but if you want to date a rock, for example, it's not about finding a rock and then going around and gathering stories of who saw this rock here, how long have you been looking at this rock, when was the first time you saw it, did you see where this rock came from? It's not about stories and anecdotes and personal experiences with the rock. They have tested and refined and improved and eventually trusted dating techniques. And there are many of them which they can use on different samples, and they can use more than one method on a sample and so on. And they use all these different methods to date a rock. And just one example I mentioned is radioactive dating, right? So that has to do with looking at rock samples and comparing its, you take a rock sample and you compare its amount of naturally occurring radioactive isotopes and its decay products, and you use known decay rates of whatever the isotope is, and then using some clever maths and formulas, you can pretty accurately figure out how old that rock is. So then, if you have a fossil or something, you can take a rock sample above it and a rock sample below it, and you can date them using the radioactive decay method, and then you can figure out, this fossil must have formed in the middle of these two. So it formed at this time, which means the animal was probably alive at this time, or the plant was probably alive at this time. And there's no faith involved. It's about facts and reliable evidence. There's pretty much no subjectivity to it. And if you're unsure about what a scientist says, if you're unsure if they got something right, if you're unsure about them and think they might be biased or something, a person can run their own tests. They can collect their own samples. They can run different tests on the same samples. They can do their own thing, and they can either say, oh, this person was right, or I got different results. What does everyone else think? Peer review is a really big thing, and that's nothing to do with anecdotes and stories and faith. Because I know this is one sentence in a really big book, but just because of this really basic misunderstanding, it kind of throws into question this author's credibility and reliability, and just, I don't think he has the expertise in these fields. And actually, no, screw expertise. I don't think he has a basic understanding of some of the stuff in these fields to really be able to talk about these topics, never mind write a book on it. Anyway, he goes on in this introduction to say things like, I learned that God wanted me to first trust completely in his word. Only then did he lead me through the evidence journey that showed me that his word was plainly written and historically true. And don't take this the wrong way, but that's just a bunch of unsubstantiated nonsense that means nothing really, isn't it? He claims, the other major lesson that I learned through this research journey was how hard the world fights against God's truth. Western culture powerfully promotes millions of years of evolution at every turn. State parks, movies, television, museums, children's books, public school curricula, everywhere I turned, my newly opened eyes saw the light of evolution on its imaginary foundation of deep time. Has you ever thought that maybe it's not Western culture fighting against God, but just rational people trusting actual evidence and science? I don't know, this whole little sentence feels a bit conspiracy theory-ish to me. Now, Daniel goes on in his introduction to talk about how he bases a lot of his understandings and evidence on what he calls the foundational rule of let scripture interpret scripture, which apparently is a pretty popular kind of statement or like rule amongst biblical scholars, apparently. And this sounded a bit dodgy to me, and Daniel didn't really give it much of an explanation, so I decided to Google it, just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting how crazy it sounded. BibleGateway.com says this: when you read a passage and wonder what something means, there is one place to turn, the rest of the scriptures. Yes, archaeologists may have some relevant information, and there may be parallels in modern literature, science, or history, but scripture is its own best interpreter. Following on from this, in a very similar vein, faithlife.com writes, because the many voices of scripture make up God's unified revelation, we want to let scripture interpret scripture. This involves examining what the Bible has to say on a topic as a whole, rather than just picking stray verses here and there and coming to a conclusion. Scripture often interprets itself. So, putting all of this and a few other sources together, we can put this very simply to mean, if you're unsure about one part of the Bible, read another part of the Bible. The best way to learn about and understand the Bible is to read more of the Bible. Outside sources are okay, but if you really want to know if you can trust the Bible, read other bits of the Bible. It is just silly, isn't it, really? The majority of us logical people would hear this and think, well, that's just full of circular logic. You can't use one thing to prove itself, right? But this seems to be the basic for most of Daniel's research in this book, and that just kind of leaves me with some serious doubts about everything else he has to say. But for some reason, this sadly seems like it's a pretty common argument or kind of technique of reasoning for a lot of Christians, and it's just a bit worrying, isn't it? So Daniel uses it here to talk about how he learned that he could trust the stories in Genesis and trust what happened in Genesis because there are other bits of the Bible that back it up. I mean, somehow he presents this as though it's this like legit meaningful argument that's like, look, in this one part of the book it says this thing, and then in a later part of the book it also says this thing, which means we can trust the entire book, and that just seems really silly to me. I mean, that's not meaningful at all, is it? But you know what, I kind of feel like maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh here. This is just the introduction. This is just like 10 pages or whatever. It's not a big part of the book. Maybe we should actually have a look at the content and judge that before we go any further, right? But this video is getting quite long, so I'm going to be looking at the first chapter in the next video, which is how do we know the Bible is reliable and was translated accurately over the centuries? Which should be pretty interesting, right? Really important question there, straight off the bat. In future chapters he covers some really interesting topics, such as, and I quote, dating rocks, dinosaurs, ape men, theistic evolution, and a good old prayer of salvation. This should be fun. I'm gonna try and look at each bit kind of like in a little bit of detail, give it a good review, maybe pick it apart a little, see which bits are interesting, see which bits might actually, you know, have some substance to them. And we're going to be looking at this over a few videos. I might spread the videos out, so not just post them like today, tomorrow, whatever. So if you want to hear more of this series when I actually talk about some of the bulk and content of this book, then please subscribe and you'll be kept up to date with all the new stuff as I put it out. But yeah, for now, thank you so much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts on, do you think Daniel is a credible author? Do you think his little organisation should get a charity status and be tax exempt? What do you think of how this book sounds so far? Do you believe in Genesis as history? I don't know, I don't want to go into this too biased. I'm going to try and like go into it pretending that I have no preconceptions about like evolution or creation or whatever. And I'm going to try and go into it with a pretty open mind, but we'll see how it goes. But for now, if you have made it through this far, thank you so much for watching, I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you again soon.